the interactions of the suspension with its environment, for example, in relation to ecologic habitat, such as aquatic flora and fauna, or as well human influences like land use or infrastructures. Therefore, they need to know and to predict the suspended sand concentration in rivers, notably in relation to sediment management, like dam flushes or dredging operations. This is notably important to ensure the hydropower generation or to manage the flood risk, as well as for the impact on infrastructure or navigation. For all of these applications, it is important to have sand flux balances and also continuous and real-time sand flux measurements. To do so, we need to know that most of the sediment transport in rivers occurs by suspension. Also, there is also bed load, but here I'll be focusing on the suspension. And in rivers, we can usually find a bimodal distribution, which is composed of fine sediments and sand-sized particles. Fine sediments are particles with a diameter smaller than 63 micrometers, and they are usually relatively homogeneously distributed in the river cross-section. They have oblate shapes and often also a porous structure. Their transport in rivers tends to be supply limited, which means it is usually dependent from the bassin's hydrology. In contrast, suspended sand particles have diameters between 63 and 2000 micrometers, and they have usually in a river cross-section significant spatial and temporal gradients, which may reach several orders of magnitude. Their shapes are usually almost spherical, although their deviations may be possible, and their transport is usually capacity or supply limited, which means that they often depend on the local hydraulic conditions. To perform the continuous sand flux monitoring, several methods exist. I first present you here the sediment rating curves, which relate the sand flux with the river discharge. And this traditional method is based on the assumption of a constant sand supply, which is usually at the equilibrium transport capacity. This means that for a specific discharge, only one sand flux is assumed. However, we can see with these measurements that important dispersion may be possible. In contrast, hydro-acoustic monitoring methods tend to aim to derive concentration as well as grain size from, for example, a backscattered acoustic signal. I detail later more about these methods. What both of these approaches have in common is that they rely usually on regular suspended sediment samplings. And those sediment samplings assume that the sand flux phi is the product of the discharge with the concentration. And usually, either we're using the mean cross-sectional concentration or concentrations in subparts of the entire cross-section. To obtain the concentration where I'm interested in my presentation, there exists, for example, the depth integrating method, where a specific sample like this one, as you can see here, is moved up and down along a specific vertical to obtain the mean vertical concentration. And therefore, we'll have a limited spatial information because we only have information on the lateral component. At the same time, it's a relatively fast method, which is not the case for the point integrating method, where specific samplers, like those ones here, were exposed here as well, exposed at different depths in the river cross-section. And there we have more spatial information, but it's much more time consuming because we're taking a lot of samples. To go back on the hydroacoustic monitoring methods, there's, for example, the vertical deployment, which is more in a moving boat configuration, where an acoustic profiler is moved throughout the river cross-section and is insonifying vertically in the river cross-section. Here, we're supposing we often have a heterogeneous suspension along the acoustic beam, which means that because the sand concentration is usually increasing with depth. Another possibility next to this spatial monitoring is the horizontal deployment, where acoustic profiler is usually fixed on the river bank and is insonifying part of the river cross-section. Here, we're supposing that there is a homogeneous concentration along this within this insonified volume. And at the same time, because of this fixed deployment, we can perform continuous measurements and thus do temporal monitoring. Both of these deployment methods are based on the principle of the active sonar, which means that we're emitting a signal, an acoustic wave, into the water column. And while this wave is propagating in the water column, two different processes occur. They can be considered as the so-called backscatter, which means the acoustic wave is scattered backwards towards the transducer, the instrument, and registered. On this registered intensity is dominated by sound particles at typical frequencies we are using for these acoustic methods, like for example here the 1 MHz. However, if the ratio S between the fine sediment and sand concentration is high, there may also be a contribution of the fine sediments to this backscatter. The second process, which may occur when our acoustic wave is propagating in the water column or in the river, is the attenuation. And here we're particularly interested in the attenuation due to sediments, which we're calling alpha sed. And at the frequencies we are using, like here, for example, 400 kilohertz in blue and 1 megahertz in red, this attenuation is dominated by fine sediments. So a lot of different theoretical formulations exist to model, for example, the attenuation or also the backscatter we've seen before, and particularly of the sound particles, because most of the acoustic theories were created and developed in the marine context. During the last decades, these works, more and more studies are also performed in rivers or also estuaries, so that there are large possibility and a large variety of calibrations exist. For example, the total sediment concentration has been related to the backscatter, or in other studies, the fine sediment concentration is related to the attenuation, here for 3 different frequencies during a specific event. Another possibility is to relate the sand concentration, here the logarithm of the sand concentration, or the backscatter. And here, this study, for example, takes also account of this ratio S between the fine sediment concentration and the sand concentration. And they also only use measurements where this ratio is relatively small to exclude the backscatter, which may originate from the sand particles. I just want to present you more in detail this method, which was created by Topping and Wright from 2016. This method aims to predict the sand concentration and sand grain size continuously with using a horizontal deployment on 3 different frequencies or 2 different frequencies. And they perform also a different treatment for fine sediment particles when relating them to sand, to the attenuation, and for sound particles when relating them to the backscatter. They have, as it is a horizontal deployment, the hypothesis that there is a homogeneity along the acoustic beam, and as well, that there is a stable relation between the insonified volume and the entire river cross-section. This method has already been applied to several rivers where it has been developed, such as the Colorado and Rio Grande rivers, as well as recently to the Chippewa River. All these rivers have grain sizes that are smaller than 200 micrometers, and the sand mean cross-sectional sand concentrations that are smaller than 10 grams per liter. With this method has been able to estimate acoustically here the sand concentration compared to the sand concentration determined by measurement with an hour factor of 2, here with the dotted line, the dashed line. Similarly, they estimated the sand grain size acoustically compared to the measured sand grain size, also with an hour factor of 2. However, this method has never been applied, rarely been applied in other contexts, but also in rivers with higher grain sizes. The aim of my research is now to improve and as well to validate hydro-acoustic methods for the monitoring of suspended sand concentration and grain size. Here in my presentation, I will focus on how and if can we apply a hydro-acoustic method to an alpine river. Here I separated this into 3 main research questions. So first, what is the achievable precision of the acoustic concentration and grain size estimates? Second, are multi-frequency methods more reliable than single-frequency methods? And third, what are the required quantity and quality of the sample data? To answer to these questions, I will apply here for my presentation the following methodology, which consists first of a data acquisition of first suspended sediment samplings and acoustic measurements, which I will then use to perform sound fix analysis and acoustic analysis to then estimate a time series of concentration and grain size. I'll apply this methodology, and I'll answer to the presented questions on the experimental site of the Isère River at Grenoble Campus. The Isère River has been chosen because it's a good example of an alpine river which is influenced by human activities, and it's also a river with relatively high suspended sand and fine sediment concentration relatively continuously. At the same time, it's a relatively strongly engineered river with many dikes and dams as well as reservoirs. And this combination leads to an important engineering interest, notably due to the sediment management in the lower Isère River, which is between Grenoble and the confluence with the Rhône River. Our study site at Grenoble Campus has the advantage of the existence of a long-term service station, which is measuring continuously discharge and total suspended sediment concentration by optical turbidimetry. Moreover, there is a cableway immediately at the hydro-sedimentary station, as well as a bridge about 200 meters upstream that facilitate the access to the river. So on this study site, I performed the following field measurements. So first, on the acoustic measurements, we used a 400 kilohertz AWARC, as well as a 1 megahertz aquadopp, which are horizontal acoustic Doppler current profilers, HADCPs, that are manufactured by Nordic. On those instruments, I decided to install them about 2 meters above the deepest point of the river cross-section, which is here the cableway cross-section, to avoid any interference of the acoustic beam with the riverbed. At the same time, you can see here that we used a specifically designed structure that allows to flip the instruments up and down and also to take them out of the water to perform maintenance. So you can see that we perform regular maintenance by our partners, and I also verified that all these debris and biofouling has no influence on our acoustic measurements. During the measurement period of 27 months, we performed acoustic measurements every 10 minutes, which led to more than 100,000 acoustic measurements for each of the 2 instruments. In addition to these acoustic measurements, we got the information, as I said before, of discharge and the total suspended sediment concentration by the station, the hydrosedimentary station. And you can see here that during the measurement period, there were 2 floods at the end of the 2021 and 2022. And we performed additionally 31 sampler suspended sediment measurements, as well as 16 pump suspended sediment measurements. So these sampler suspended sediment measurements were performed either here at the cableway or at the bridge cross-section. And on this cableway cross-section, we used the US point samplers. So first we used the USP72, which appeared later to be too light for the higher velocity and discharges we observed at our study site. That's why we changed it to a USP6, which we learned from University of Tours, because it was more adapted to our high velocities and discharges. And with these 2 samplers, we sampled point sampling close to the river surface, close to the riverbed, as well as samplings within the insonified volume by the HADCPs. And because here we got water samples, we performed a separation by filtration to analyze the concentration of fine sediments and sand sediments separately. At the bridge cross-section upstream, we used the Delft-Battle sampler, which is a sampler that is exposed longer than these US samplers, which thus allows us to obtain also temporal integration of the concentration. And here we usually measured 5 verticals with up to 4 or 5 points per vertical. Simultaneously to these samplings on these 2 cross-sections, we performed ADCP measurements where multi-transect averages yield information on velocity, discharge, and river depth. So these measurements yield information on the sand and fine sediment concentration for the US samplers and only sand concentration for the Delft-Battle, as well as the grain size distribution. In total, we obtained 31 measurements of these sampler suspended sediment measurements. There are over 19 on the cableway cross-section. Now, on the pump suspended sediment measurements, we used the pump PP36, which was usually attached to the frame of the Delft-Battle, and usually we sampled at the same height as the Delft-Battle, or same depth as the Delft-Battle. And for 7 samplings, we sampled continuously with the pump and the Delft-Battle sampler. With these samplings, we obtain information on the sand concentration and in total performed 16 measurements. Now we've performed many different measurements using different samples at different cross-sections. So we also compared the results of the Delft bottle on the bridge cross-section, and here the mean cross-sectional concentration of the Delft bottle, as well as the mean cross-sectional sand concentration determined by the USP6. And we can see there is an important underestimation of the sand concentration determined by the Delft bottle. And because we later wanted to use the results of the Delft bottle for the acoustic analysis, I then applied a correction for these Delft bottles for my acoustic analysis. We also performed two specific comparison experiments comparing the pump PP36 and the USP6, where we measured several point concentrations at the same depth and simultaneously. So we can compare the concentration determined by the pump compared to the one by the P6, and we can see that the real cells are usually relatively consistent in terms of concentration and as well in terms of grain size. When talking about grain size, I'm particularly interested in as well to obtain accurate and precise information on the grain size measurement. Here, I just want to show you an example of this article where I tested 3 different, in this case, laser diffraction instruments to measure the expected percentage of a bimodal mixture. And here you can see there are important divergences between these 3 instruments and also compared to this expected percentage which we prepared. This incurrent measurement, what we explained is what the so-called mixture effect, what we call the masking of the sediment particles, of course the sediment particles, by finer sediment particles. I've also tested several other possible reasons, which is, for example, the impact of the stirrer speed on these bimodal samples. And based on these observations of divergences between the fine sediment and sand particle measurements, I recommend to separate the fractions for the grain size measurements and those of the sand for the grain size measurements. At the same time, I also recommend to determine the measurement protocol for any new samples where we don't know the characteristics before. So now to conclude on these field and laboratory measurements, we've seen on this sampler comparison that the results of the pump and the PP36 are relatively consistent in terms of concentration and grain size, and that the Delft bottle tends to measure lower concentrations than the USP6 sampler. Concerning the grain size analysis using laser diffractions, we have seen the so-called mixture effect, where I then recommend to measure fine sediment and sand particles separately for the grain size analysis, what I also did for all my grain size analysis for this thesis. With my colleagues, we also created a large open access dataset. It covers various hydrosedimentary conditions at Grenoble Campus, which contains continuous hydro-acoustic measurements, as well as suspended sediment samplings of the suspended sediment samplers, the pump, automatic pumping samples I have presented, as well as the ADCP discharge and velocity measurements. I then used these measurements to go on for the sand flux analysis. Here I used the existing sand flux sand discharge computing method, SDC, which has been developed in our research group. It aims to determine the sand discharge distribution, sand concentration distribution in the entire cross-section, as well as the mean cross-sectional sand concentration. To do so, it uses ADCP multi-transect averages, as well as which it combines with distributed point sampling in the river cross-sections, which are then vertically and laterally integrated in the cross-section to obtain spatialized information on the sand concentration. In addition to this method, I complemented it with the error estimation, where I estimated the uncertainty in the sand flux through a river cross-section. This estimation method, I take several sources of error into account, and I particularly focused here on the uncertainty due to the vertical integration. I then applied this SDC method to my measurements at Grenoble Campus, and you can see here that I took account for the uncertainty in the vertical integration, as well as in the lateral integration, as well as which are usually the most important uncertainties, as well as the uncertainty in discharge and the systematic uncertainty. This application of the SDC method and the uncertainty estimation method allowed me to determine the expanded uncertainty over all sample suspended sediment measurements at Grenoble Campus, which accounts for 33%. Applying the SDC method to my suspended sediment samplings, I also may establish a sediment weighting curve, here only on the sample suspended sediment measurements. And for the sediment weighting curve, I use the empirical power rating curve with a critical discharge. We can see this when fitting it only to the sample suspended sediment measurements, that it is relatively consistent with the pump sediment measurements. And we can also see when we add the two results from the flood of 2023 that they are also consistent with our previously established rating curve. To now conclude on this SandFlex analysis, I completed this SDC SandFlex analysis by using as well a vertical integration using Bayesian modeling, which I first only used for the vertical uncertainty, but then complemented also the methodology itself. And when comparing this SDC method with the ISO standard results, we may observe relatively large differences. However, we have to take account that no reference exists, so we cannot really evaluate which is the true and valuable method. And we can also see that there is no obvious bias. In addition, I developed an uncertainty estimation method, which was the most important part of my work here. And this is the first uncertainty estimation method to estimate the uncertainty in the SandFlex using point sampling. And it also includes several sources of uncertainty, such as the ones in vertical integration or lateral integration, and is relatively easily applicable to different rivers and sampling protocols like here on the Amazon. However, to go further, it would also be still necessary to estimate several sources of uncertainty which could be improved. And also further validation is required, for example, using a larger data set, or for example, using a model reconstructed concentration field to really test this method. I then used the results of the SandFlex analysis and our acoustic measurements for the acoustic analysis, and also to estimate time series of concentration and grain size. Here I applied the geofrequency method of topping and write from 2016, which I called TW16 in my manuscript. Just to remind you of this method, so here we're relating the beam average values in the insonified volume within the entire cross-section. And we're also separating fine sediments and sand fractions. Because it's a horizontal method, we suppose that there's a homogeneity along the acoustic beam and that there's a stable relation between the insonified volume and the entire cross-section. This is a two-step method, which first has as a first part this single frequency calibration procedure, which uses the results of the 1 megahertz and 400 kilohertz in our case instruments, which are then used for the dual frequency roots-based approach. And this roots-based approach uses a relative concept, which is called the relative unit target strength roots. And this roots is based on the so-called unit target strength, UTS. This UTS is the backscatter of a suspension of particles, which depends on the median diameter of the grain size, of a grain size distribution, as well as its width, the sigma, which is also its standard deviation, as well as the acoustic frequency. The method then uses the so-called reference suspension, and this reference suspension is the sand suspension that is characteristic for a specific study site, in our case, the Grenoble Campus, and is also constant of the study site. And it's characteristic in terms of the grain size and the grain size width, as well as the concentration. Well, knowing this reference suspension, we may then determine the UTS, that's the target strength, of this reference suspension. So we can then determine this UTS ref, which is constant. At the same time, we may also, this suspension in the river is still changing and changing grain sizes. So we can then calculate the unit target strength for all different grain sizes that may occur at our study site, which is here the UTS at this dashed line. In the next step, we may determine the difference between the UTS, that's the UTS of all our possible grain size distributions, compared to our reference suspension, what is our roots? And this root is the backscatter of a suspension compared to the backscatter of our reference suspension. And the method of tapping it wide frequently uses this roots relation depending on grain size. Using this principle is thus used through the entire method. So first I show you this single frequency calibration procedure. It is performed separately for each of the two frequencies present at the study site. Here we are applying a linear regressions on our acoustic profiles to determine the attenuation. We're then using the attenuation to relate it with our fine sediment concentrations that we determined simultaneously with our attenuation measurements, acoustic measurements, which allows us then to determine time series of the fine sediment concentration. Then using in the next step the attenuation and the acoustic profiles to determine the backscatter and the beam average backscatter. While then relating this beam average backscatter with the logarithm of the sand concentration in a so-called BBC relation, the base backscatter calibration. This relation allows us to determine the single frequency sand concentration and its time series. So now about this base backscatter relation, it relates, as I said, the logarithm of the sand concentration or the backscatter, and for each of the two frequencies separately. However, not all of the measurements are used because we want to only include measurements where the S, that's the ratio between the fine sediment concentration and the sand concentration, is lower than 2, because we want to avoid the fine sediments to contribute to the backscatter. For suspension with relatively high S, there's also a B prime called backscatter correction, which I'm not presenting here. Moreover, we use here the reference sand suspension, so we only include measurements where our grain size is close to the grain size of the reference suspension for these PBC relations. However, applying strictly these criteria of the standard hopping and wide method, I had no measurements that were corresponding to these criteria. That's why I had to extend these criteria using a S smaller than 3, and here 0.4. I used the results of the single frequency calibration procedure for the dual frequency-based roots approach. Here I combine the results of the two single frequency results, and I also use the results of our reference sand suspension. I then determine the roots relation for the lower frequency HADCP, which is in our case the 400 kilohertz instruments, and I use the information of the results of our single frequency calibration to determine our grain size for a specific acoustic measurement. This grain size is then the dual frequency grain size estimated by the acoustic method, which allows us to determine its time series. And next step, I determine the roots of the higher frequency, that's here the 1 megahertz profiler, and we use this grain size to determine the roots on this higher frequency relation. This result here is then combined with the results of the single frequency calibration to determine time series of the sand concentration. So this dual frequency method yields results of the sand concentration and the sand grain size. When applying this method, I just want to show you a few modifications I applied to this standard method, which I call TW16A in my manuscript. So the original method of the TW16A uses the entire beam to determine the attenuation using a linear regression. However, in my application, I performed the adaptations. I just want to show you about the modified area of the beam I used. And I applied this modification because I had observations of nonlinear profile forms. For example, here in the part close to the instruments, where I had increasing intensities, as well as in the distant part, where there's also increasing intensities. So first, to exclude these areas close to the transducer, I now used, compared to the manuscript, I now used the Downing critical distance instead of the 3 cells only, and to exclude this part close to the transducers. And to work on the distant part, we should just imagine that the water stage is changing depending on discharge. So the beam may possibly intersect the river surface or also the HGCPs maybe outside of the water. So we do not want to use the measurements that are behind of the intersection with the beam and the surface. So I applied a buffer zone of 5 meters to also avoid any interferences with the river surface. So applying these slight adaptations, which I called the TW16A in my manuscript, as well as the standard method, I am able to estimate dual frequency sand concentration and grain size time series. And I also can compare it to the sampler and pump measurements. Here you can also see the sand references concentration as well as the reference grain size. We can see here that during the spring period of 2021, the concentration is higher than the reference sand concentration, and that during the same period, the grain sizes measured and acoustically estimated are smaller than the reference sand grain size. We can make similar observations for the spring period in 2021 and 2023, but less pronounced. So now using this time series, I then determined the cumulated fluxes for this measurement period from April 2021 to June 2023. And we can, I did this here for the dual frequency method, the rating curve method I've presented previously, as well as separately for the single frequency results of the 1 megahertz and 400 kilohertz. So these two single frequency measurements, which means that they are not corrected for any grain size bias, so that they may be still affected by changing grain sizes. We can still see that the differences in the total masses estimated during the 27 months are relatively similar, particularly between the dual frequency and the rating curve method, and among the others, they are within our factor of 2. So based on this little difference, we can say that there's probably an equilibrated long-term sand transport in the study at our study site, but we can see that there are important differences at year-one scale, because notably the rating curve supposes an equilibrium. However, the HGCPs tend to measure in situ conditions and will to react to the in situ sand concentration and grain size changes. This is what we can particularly see here in the spring period 2021, where the two single frequency measurements, in particular the 400 kilohertz, are strongly affected by these smaller grain sizes, which are highly different from the reference suspension and the reference sand grain size. So here I just want to show you an event during the spring period 2021 of higher discharges of up to 500 cubic meters per second. And we can see here that the sand concentration acoustically determined by the dual frequency method reaches 4 grams per liter, while the rating curve does not that much react. Similarly, for the grain sizes, we can see that at the moment when the discharge is increasing, we have a slight decrease of the grain size, which also relates to our observation of our samplings, where the sand grain size is decreasing with increasing discharge. So we can still see that there is a reaction on the sensitivity of our dual frequency acoustic method to the grain size changes. I then compared the acoustically estimated sand concentration by the dual frequency here compared to our sand concentration determined by the measurements. And I can see here that compared to the measurements by the sampler suspended sediment measurements, which were used for the calibration, and to the pump measurements that were only used here for the validation, that the estimations are usually within our factor of 2, or sometimes up to 5, which is still considered as acceptable because of this important variability of more than 2 orders of magnitude of the sand concentration. So we can say that the dual frequency estimates are consistent with the measurement. We can obtain similar results or conclusions for the 2 single frequency estimates, so the 400 kilohertz and the 1 megahertz, and compared to our measurements. Here we can see that the 400 kilohertz is slightly more dispersed, while the 1 megahertz tends to underestimate slightly more the concentration. To now talk about the grain size, here is again the dual frequency grain size estimates compared to the measurements, and we can also see that we can estimate it within our factor of 2. but which is also similar to the estimate with an hour factor of 2 for our concentration, and also the estimates of the original method of topping and white in the Colorado and Rio Grande rivers were also able to estimate with an hour factor of 2 concentration and grain size. However, based on this little difference, this little variability of our grain size between 100 and 350 micrometers, I believe that this precision of this hour factor of 2 does only yields limited additional knowledge compared to our prior knowledge of our measurements. I then wondered about this high sensitivity in these variations in our hour factors. So that's why I prepared a comparison between our model and our acoustic measurements. So we can see here the roots relation for the 400 kilohertz we've seen previously. And I prepared this model based on the reference suspension and the acoustic models. I also calculated the roots for our measurements using the concentration and the acoustic measurements. And we can see here that there's an important difference and important dispersion of the measurements compared to our model. So I suppose that also these divergences may account for a part of the variability in our concentration and grain size estimates. So similarly, for these backscatter roots, I performed this also for the attenuation alpha cell, where I modeled the attenuation and separating it into the attenuation of fine sediments and the attenuation of sand-sized sediments. And I am able to determine the modeled attenuation using the concentration, the grain size, and also the grain size width of a specific sample of our sampler suspended sediment samples, for example. So I then determined this modeled attenuation here on the x-axis compared to our measurements. And here we can see that they are also within an hour factor of 2, and also that the 400 kilohertz tends to overestimate the measurements compared to the model. At the same time, we can also see there is kind of a threshold. It's 0.1 decibels per meter approximately. Below this threshold, there's an important dispersion between our acoustic measurements and our acoustic models. And similar observations of these divergences between backscatter and attenuation have also been previously made by other studies. To now conclude on this acoustic analysis, I've improved the description and also the repeatability of the acoustic dual frequency method of topping and white. And it's also one of the only studies where an acoustic method is applied by another research group and in another context than only by its creators. I also validated this method in a river with different conditions, such as queercer sands and lower S, those are ratios between fine sediments and sands, and also highlighted possibly required adaptations, such as here on the neon far field or the buffer zone, as well as the SNR, which I haven't presented here. And finally, I've observed the divergences between the acoustic measurements and the models concerning attenuation and backscatter, which may be possible reasons for these important uncertainties in our acoustic estimates. So now to prepare some general conclusions and perspectives, I was interested in the beginning of this presentation on what are the required quantity and quality of the sample data. So we've seen that samples are not only important to have an important number of samples, but they should also cover all hydrosedimentary conditions at the study site so that we can establish a good representative reference concentration. And to obtain these samples, it is recommendable to use a combined sampling strategy of mean cross-sectional measurements, as well as one-point measurements on the bank to obtain a high temporal resolution, and also to be able to measure events where you are not able to go on the field or specific events. And of course, we are interested in having a low uncertainty in our input data for the acoustic models, because we want to have a low uncertainty in these sound concentrations. To move forward, all this work on the sampling, we may use optical in situ instruments, like for example, the LIST 200X, for example, to obtain information on in situ grain size. Moreover, we could perform comparison validation experiments, for example, under controlled conditions in the field or in the lab, or using modeling, which may give us further insights into the sample type, the uncertainty analysis, or as well the Sunflex analysis. And we may also use vertical acoustic measurements like single or dual frequency measurements to improve the vertical or lateral integration of our Sunflex method, like our STC method. And at a long-term scale, an international homogenization of the sand sampling and analysis methods is recommendable or interesting to be able to compare our measurements across the world. So now, to talk more about hydroacoustics, I was interested in what is the achievable precision of acoustic concentration and grain size estimates. We've heard that the sand concentration predictions are possible with the method at our study site with an hour factor of 2, which corresponds to the literature for the sand concentration predictions, and taking account for the important variability of the sand concentration. This means that the sand acoustic sand concentration monitoring is ready for operational use. However, we obtain the same precision for the sand grain size predictions while taking account for the low variability of the sand grain size. This is not yet ready or does not yield any additional value for operational purposes. Now, concerning the use of multi-frequency methods compared to single frequency methods, so we've seen that the multi-frequency methods, here I use the dual frequency methods, may yield information on the grain size. Also, it's not yet operational, but it may yield information, as we've seen at the Villeurbanne scale, because of the sensibility of the acoustic methods for the grain size. And it also offers concentration estimates that are less grain size biased. In contrast, concerning single frequency estimates, we've seen that there are different reliabilities, but that the 1 megahertz has been slightly more reliable than the 400 kilohertz, which tends to be more affected by changes in grain size due to its lower frequency. To move forward, there's this acoustic analysis, several perspectives. We first focus on decreasing the large uncertainties in the acoustic methods, and for example, to make the prediction of the grain size more operational. As well, this could be then, for example, comparing and combining vertical and horizontal acoustic method to improve the lateral and vertical integration. As well, use calibrated acoustic instruments like the Grenoble Campus, which may help to decrease also the sampling effort in the field. And at a larger scale or longer time scale, acoustic models are necessary that also are adjusted and suited to ablate natural sediment particles as we can find them in our fine sediments in rivers. So now my works on the grain size, the Sunflex analysis, the samplings, as well as the acoustic analysis helped us to move a step forward towards the continuous and operational Sunflex monitoring. Our applied research aim from the beginning was to measure continuous Sunflex sand concentration and sand grain size. With the application and the installation of our hydrosedimentary station at Grenoble Campus, we've installed the first hydroacoustic sand concentration monitoring station in France, which is also which will now continue in operational continuation by our partners of EDF and CNR. And the conclusion of my thesis will also be used for the installation of new hydroacoustic measurement stations on the Rhône River here at Perrache in Lyon, where different hydroacoustic instruments will be used for sand concentration monitoring. Well, thank you.